the beginning part of the Canterbury Tales, you will notice that I went ahead and put in some study guides right here in the reading list. And I'm going to do this throughout the units as we progress through the term. Good morning, Mrs. Torres. As we go through our reading material, I just finished going over the syllabus for the dual class, so now we're just getting started on today's material. You'll see these green study guides, and I'm going to put these in throughout the term. So when the next unit opens up, next week we're finishing up this unit. After that, when the second unit opens, you'll see the reading list and you'll see these green study guides. These are designed to serve two purposes. Number one, it's sort of like a self-check. There aren't any quizzes for this course. So it's a way for you to kind of look at the study guide, and it will ask you some general questions about the material that leads up to that study guide. Let me open this one and show you. We were working with this one last time, but I added one for the Canterbury Tales, and I'm going to do that through the term. So the idea is, if you're finished reading this piece, Beowulf, for example, and you want to check and see, do you understand the material well enough to do a good job with your discussions and to do a good job with your posts and also with your papers and with the midterm, you can go in and ask yourself these questions and just kind of think of it as a self-quiz. If you struggle with answering these questions, then I would say you're not reading to the depth that is needed for the course. When I do the lectures each class day and ask, are there any questions? I'm going over terminology that I know is on the midterm, going over background things that the text didn't tell you, and I'm drawing your attention to the main elements of the reading. I'm not talking about everything in the reading assignment. So this is a good way for you to just double check. If you look at these and you can answer all of these, then you can say, okay, well, I guess I understand this material well enough. If you have trouble with some of these, then you probably need to go back, reread with more depth, and as you're reading for the course, kind of focus, take your time, give yourself more time to read the reading materials, ask questions in class. So as we go through the material, we already did this one last time, but you can see I added one for Canterbury Tales. So when we're finished with the material for that one, you can use that to check you. The other way you can use that study guide is I will, when we finish all the readings for the Canterbury Tales, all of these, I will say, is there anything on the study guide that you want me to talk about? So in that class period, when we wrap up the Partner's Tale, looking on the calendar, that is next Thursday, I'll say to you, hey, hopefully you had a chance to look at the study guide. Is there anything on there that you want me to spend some time talking about so you can get some notes? And in that way, I'm hoping that we can make sure that everybody's reading, in time with the calendar and also with the depth that's required for the midterm. So any questions about those study guides? You'll see them in every reading list unit in the units. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I will just continue. Today's reading was to read the background information and the beginning part of the general prologue for the Canterbury Tales. I don't know if you read in the PDF or whether you used the interlinear text, which I showed you last time, is got the translated version there. It's probably a little faster, a little bit easier. So that's a way for you to read more thoroughly, I think. I think if you just read from the textbook, it probably is challenging because it's in the Middle English and it probably takes you a lot longer to read through that. But I want to do the notes from your reading assignment and just double check. You can double check with your notes to make sure that you have all of this information that I'm going to highlight right now, noted for future reference. So in the textbook, I asked you to read this background on the author, Geoffrey Chaucer. And one of the first things that they bring up, make sure you put the dates in there. I always I'll tell you right now, there are not any specific questions on the midterm about dates, but you do want to kind of mentally have a time frame of when these authors were living and which time periods they were writing and what the qualities of that time period are. So it's kind of good to make a note just about time periods. They have CA here because that means circa. We don't know for sure what year Chaucer was born. So sometimes in these old things, there aren't very good records. So that's what they mean by that. But we're talking about the 14th century and the second half of the 14th century as we're working through medieval literature. So just kind of keep that as a frame of reference in mind while we're going through the background stuff. They talk about medieval society, and I think that's really important to have notes on because Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a wealth of information about the time period. Chaucer was in a really unique spot, and the text goes into that for his ability to understand and observe lots of walks of life and different types of people. He traveled to Europe because he was a page with the king. And so he was privy to a lot of different types of people from different walks of life, but most people would not be. Most people, it was a caste system. So if you were a peasant, which was the majority of the people, you basically spent your time with peasants and you did peasant things. You were a manual laborer more than likely, and your existence was sort of hand to mouth. The nobility, if you were titled, if you were a lord or a royal, that was a whole different kind of life. And getting out of those levels of society was not very likely. You know, if your dad was a ditch digger, then you were a ditch digger, your brother's a ditch digger, everybody's a ditch digger in your family because titles were handed down to people and their children. So you weren't going to have an opportunity to become nobility very often if you were a peasant. There is a third estate, and that's the church. Sometimes people decided to join and become a priest or a monk or a nun, but those were people from the noble class. Commoners did not go into the realm of church service. They were just commoners. And that is by far the largest group. There is, I know I just said that there's three and it's unlikely that you're going to get out of it, but we start to see the glimmer at this point in time. And even in the Canterbury Tales, we start to see this emerging middle class. And the people at the time probably were not aware of it. We can look back in time and we can say, oh, this is probably when that started. We can see that now because of perspective, but we can't see that at the time usually. And so we do see an emerging middle class. What started to happen is some of these peasants ended up, scraping together a little bit of money, investing it, and becoming a merchant or a tradesman or something that would take them out of the lowest level of society, but they could never break into nobility because they could never be titled. So what is that then? If you saved your money and now you're a successful merchant and you're trading, overseas, what does it mean if you have money but you're not in the nobility? Well, there's this emerging middle class that we start to see. And there are characters, I made a little list of them over here, that we see in Canterbury Tales that demonstrate that. There's a Franklin, there's a merchant, there are some tradesmen that don't really fit comfortably in the peasant category, and they don't fit comfortably either in the nobility. So Chaucer starts to describe this aspect in the tales, and we can look back now and say that's probably where that happened. The background stuff then starts to talk about Chaucer's own, sort of experiences and what might have caused him to know so much about so many different types of people. How can you write effectively about people of varying backgrounds and varying personality types if you haven't had the occasion to observe them? So it talks about how he was placed into some very wealthy households as a page. A page is just a messenger, and as a child, and then he ended up in the employ of King Edward III. And so he was taken on many excursions to, they talk right here about Spain and France and Italy. The average commoner at this time wouldn't have traveled anywhere beyond 5 or 10 miles from their village in their lifetime. Just think about it. It's all, buggies and horses. So the fact that he traveled with the king to all these locations gave him a view into society that most commoners did not have, and that informs his work. They talk about that there. All right. One of the next topics that I think you should have notes on here is about how Chaucer wrote in English. We call him often the father of English poetry because people were generally writing in French if they wanted to have legitimate literature. But Chaucer wrote in English. Being a commoner, it was his common language. He understood other languages, but he wrote his pieces in English. And for the time period, most people didn't consider English a legitimate official language. It was sort of a language of the common people coming up from the Anglo-Saxon. And so most people did not write in English, but Chaucer did a lot to legitimize English because this work was well received and is also, pretty famous. And so he brought English in as a more legitimate language. I think it's important to make a distinction, especially since we'll be studying the English Renaissance later on. And the textbook talks about how the Italian Renaissance occurred and Chaucer got to participate in that because of these trips that he went on with the noble class people that he worked for. And so he went to Florence, which is the birthplace of the Renaissance, and actually observed the art and the burgeoning and flourishing of music and all of the Renaissance changes that were happening with writing and so on in the Italian Renaissance during his life. That happened at the end of the 14th century when Chaucer was living. There was not a Renaissance in England until almost 100 years later. It wasn't like all of Europe had a Renaissance all at once. Nowadays we have communication that allows us to see what's trending and what's popular and what kind of music people are making or art immediately around the world because we have the internet. But they had, horses and buggies, and that was about it. So it took a good 100 years before we can start to see the influence of the Italian Renaissance on English literature. So that's going to be the next unit that we study because it wasn't really happening in England at the time. But Chaucer was able to experience that when he went to Italy. So they talk about how his travels into these other countries and reading material from other authors influenced his own work. Now, to us, that's kind of like stealing. If you take somebody else's story and change it a little bit and submit it as your own story, that's plagiarism. We were just talking about that with the syllabus. But in Chaucer's time, and really through the Renaissance, it was kind of expected that stories would get recycled. And the interesting thing was to see, how is this author going to tell this story? So several of Chaucer's stories are original, but many of them come from some of these other stories that they mention in other pieces. What's something else I highlighted here? This is just a good way, this little paragraph here on page 216 is just a way to kind of sum up that Chaucer was in this peculiar position of being a commoner, but in the constant environment of the wealthy and the noble. So the fact that he was a writer in that position makes it extraordinarily special that he was able to write the Canterbury Tales because he could write about people of all walks of life, and he did in great detail, which you start to see in the general prologue. The second part of the introductory material talks about the tales itself. Canterbury Tales is a very famous work. Maybe you've heard of it before. It's a frame tale, which is a term that you need to know. Let me expand this diagram here. I had to make a diagram because I couldn't find one that wanted to show what I wanted to express to you. So frame tale is definitely a term that shows up on the midterm. And when we say a frame tale, we mean that there is an umbrella story, and within the umbrella story are multiple other stories. So there's a frame, and then within the frame, there are other stories. So Chaucer envisioned a work for the Canterbury Tales that was about some pilgrims who were leaving London to go and pray at the cathedral in Canterbury, which is about 70 miles outside of London. It's still there today. The cathedral's still there. And so they were going to go there, and they meet up at this inn called the Tabard Inn. I put it here. That is also on the midterm, so make sure that you put that in your notes. The Tabard Inn is sort of like the last inn or like stop before you go on this long trip to Canterbury. For us, it's not a long trip. 70 miles in the car is like what, an hour, hour and a half, depending on how fast you drive. But for them on horseback, it's a couple of days. So Chaucer puts all of these pilgrims assembled at this inn. Some of them know each other, but most of them do not know each other. They're all stopping there because they're leaving the next day to go on this trip. And so they're at the Tabard Inn, and they all realize that they're traveling the next day, and they're gonna group up together because it's safer that way and they can pass the time getting to know each other. So that's the frame tale. All these pilgrims are traveling together to the cathedral. The subtales come in down here in the diagram. So there are about 30 pilgrims that are traveling in Chaucer's idea for this work. And they set up this contest where each pilgrim is going to tell 2 stories on the way there and 2 stories on the way back. So that's pretty ambitious. If there are 30 pilgrims and they're each telling 4 stories, that's like, what, 120 some stories. So as each pilgrim tells their story, each one of these boxes kind of represents that. In between, there are things that are happening with the pilgrims. I didn't like that story, or, oh, that was a very good story, or they're chit-chatting between them. And so there are these little prologues that happen between the tales. Now, Chaucer did not finish all these tales. He only finished, well, we have about 24, but some of them are fragments. He never finished the work. It's pretty ambitious. He maybe should have picked 5 pilgrims or something like that. But the idea is that they're passing the time by telling these stories, and then whoever wins, whoever tells the best story, ends up getting the prize of dinner when they get back. So 2 stories on the way there, 2 stories on the way back, and then whoever told the best one, they vote on it. Whoever told the best one gets a free dinner when they return. And so that's the basic idea for the story, and that is called a frame tale. Let me put this back over here. And so they talk about that here in the text. They're going to Canterbury to pray at the shrine for St. Thomas of Becket. St. Thomas of Becket was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. You definitely should know that name. He was murdered in his own cathedral due to political rivalries. And so he's a martyr and a saint. And the pilgrims decide that they're going to go there mainly to pray and thank the saint for helping them through the winter. The beginning of the general prologue I'll show you in a minute. You should have already read it, but I'll explain it. It's springtime, and they're thanking God and also the saint for helping them through, and they're healthy and they didn't die. The plague is happening at this point, the Black Plague. So if you could make it through the winter and the Black Plague, you were pretty grateful. And people went on pilgrimages then to go to the Canterbury Cathedral to pray and thank God for their survival through the winter. And springtime is the time to do that. The weather's more amenable to it. So they talk about this, the frame tale and this background of the time period and so on. I think it's important to note that the text says Chaucer's pilgrim narrators represent a wide spectrum of ranks and occupations, because he could write about people from all walks of life having had the experience that he did in his lifetime. It's not realistic to think that the people who are actually in the tales would actually be traveling together. There's a knight, he would never be traveling with, a dishonest partner. He just wouldn't. So, but Chaucer is imagining that they were traveling together so that he can do this cross section of society. There's a variety of different types of stories, from courtly romance, which is a lot like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, to Fableau, which are stories that have sort of risque, almost nasty events happening. The Miller's Tale and the I can't remember who the one is that tells it after him. The Miller's Tale is famous for that. They're kind of, you know, kind of dirty stories, but in a cross section of people, some people would tell a dirty story, and that's kind of the thing that Chaucer, that's brilliant about this work, right? Chaucer can say, "What wasn't me telling that dirty story? It was the miller." Well, he created the miller, right? So that the miller could tell the story. So he gets to absolve himself by deferring off on his narrators. But he also gets the freedom as a writer of like envisioning, what would a miller, I've created this miller character, what kind of story would he tell if he was on a trip? Well, probably not a very nice one, because I made him gruff and kind of mean, and you know. So he gets to imagine, what would this, you know, tender lady tell? What kind of story would she tell? And it's kind of like an additional creative aspect to his work. I already talked about how the tale is unfinished. We can't really date when he wrote which ones. It was over a long period of time that he wrote them. Scholars have tried to put them in order, and so sometimes if you're looking at a work of Canterbury Tales, there's an accepted order that he wrote them. But like I said, some of them are unfinished, and only 24 were actually documented. You can look right here. This is on page 217 of the text. You can look right here and see some of the characters, some of the different narrators that tell the stories: the knight, miller, summoner, friar. We're going to read the wife of Bath, her prologue and her tale, and we're going to read the pardoner, his prologue and his tale. But they're just representations, you know, representatives of the work as a whole. The physician, the nun's priest, all of these are different pilgrims that are on their trip. And I highlighted them through here. It'd be kind of good to know the types of characters that are showing up on the trip there. There is a term that you need to know. It talks about how Chaucer was able to create these portraits of these pilgrims in great detail, some more than others. But there's a term that the text uses that I want you to make sure you have notes on, and that is verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is the idea that something is lifelike. Like, I could see this person is described in such detail as a round character, and I could see how that person would respond to things, and there's a lifelike quality to that character. Okay, any questions on the background stuff? I know that's not the most exciting. I guess that was my observation. All right, the last little part to talk about today is a little bit of the general prologue. The general prologue is like 20 pages long, and what it is basically is an introduction to the frame narrative. Chaucer has to set it up so that all these pilgrims are going on this trip, and he has to introduce us to all of those characters. And so that what we call the general prologue does that. And it starts here. I don't know if you read the text in Middle English or if you read the interlinear text, this one over here. Probably this one. It takes less time to read this because it's got the translation there. But if we look at the general prologue, or we call it the Gen Pro, he's talking at first about the springtime. I can read this to you if you want to hear what it sounds like. Do you want to hear what it sounds like in Middle English? Oh, of course. Oh, now we get all the responses. Okay. It goes like this. You can follow along. It goes, Juan Narapri with the shu risota, the Dr. Marshath person to the rota, and bathed every vine and switch liqueur of which vertu engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus eke with his sweaty breath and spirit hath in every holt and hath the tender cropis, and the youngest son a half in the ram is held corsirona, and smalle fulis makin melodia that slept in all the night with open ear. So pricketh him nature in her courages, the longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmeris what you say can strungus strundus, to ferne hallways couth in sundry Londis. And specially from every sheery's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful march for to seka, that hem that holpen won that they were seka. So yay. I had to memorize that in my Chaucer class in college, and I never forgot it. We had to perform that for our professor, and it was a graduate class that I was taking as an undergraduate, so it was tough. In any case, we didn't get to read it in translation. We had to read the whole thing in this. But that's what it sounds like. And basically, he's saying what? It's springtime, it's April, and things have passed. It's not winter anymore. The temperature's nicer for travel. So people come out and they want to go on a pilgrimage to thank God and also to thank the saint for helping them through the winter. And so they start to wend. Wend means to wander or travel, to go and see the martyr from England to Canterbury. So that's basically what they're saying there. If you continue reading that, you'll find out that he's at the Tabard Inn. We already talked about that. And there's all these different types of people who have ended up there in fellowship, and they discovered that they're all leaving the next day to go to Canterbury. And so the suggestion is, why don't we all go together in a group, and we can have this contest and it'll all be jolly and merry, and we'll be safer that way. Chaucer is in the story. He makes himself a character in the story. And so he says in the general prologue, so I decided the night before, since everybody was there in the inn, right? He's there in the inn. He says, I just decided to go and kind of sit with all the different people and just see who was it that was going on our trip. He's kind of like the busybody. So I'm going to tell you all the stuff I found out about all the different pilgrims. So he says, nevertheless, while I have time and space in this writing, before I go any further in this tale, let me tell you all about the condition of each of them, it seemed to me, which they were and of what degree, like what status they were, and in what array, what would their clothes look like, you know, so you could start picturing the people that are going on this trip together. And so then he starts in with the knight. And I think I asked you to read to the knight. You should have read about the knight, the squire, and the yeoman. And maybe you read the prioress. I don't know if you read the prioress. But he starts talking about the knight, and he says that this particular knight was chivalrous and full of honor. He was an experienced warrior. There's a list of, he's fought in Christendom, which would be, you know, civilized Europe, but also heatheness, which refers to, you know, the Middle East, where they went on crusades. Maybe you studied the crusades in your history class. And he said this knight fought all over the place, and there's a list of all the different places where he fought, which tells us two things. He's older, he's also a good warrior, because otherwise he would be dead. Right? If you're not a good warrior, you're not going to make it through very many battles. He's been in 15 mortal battles, and he's been to the Crusades. They talk about him being in Turkey and Palestine. And matter of fact, in his description, it talks about how he's wearing, when they talk about array, they mean the clothing that they were wearing. He's wearing the exact armor that he just returned from war. He's still wearing like the armor that's rusted and, you know, like all nasty from the war. And he's going immediately to the cathedral. So we assume that he is such a good knight that he's going to the cathedral in order to purge his sins. Probably he had to kill some people and feel cleansed from his job as a knight. He has a son with him who is a squire. A squire is like a knight in training. So this squire is described as a lover and a lusty bachelor. The squire uses his position to get the ladies, right? He uses the fact that he's in training to be a knight to attract women. It's, I guess, his opening line, right? And he has been in a few battles, but they're mainly just there in France. He hasn't extensively traveled like his father because he's young. You do need, these footnotes, by the way, will help you a lot as you're reading. He cares about his appearance. It talks about how he doesn't sleep at night because he's got so many ladies knocking on his door. He's got very specific clothing that's fashionable, and you know, he's got his hair just right, and he sings and dances in all the modern ways. So he's just like, you know, Mr. Cool. They have a yeoman with him. So this is like a group of 3. Sometimes there are 2 people that are traveling together, or a group of 3, or a group of 5, but then there's also singletons. The yeoman is the last one that I asked you to read, really, and he's with them, but he's their servant. A yeoman is somebody who takes care of your equipment. So the knight and the squire require that that rhymed. They require that they have all their equipment properly maintained, oiled, ready to go. You know, the arrows need to be straight. You know, you have to make the arrows. And so the yeoman is in charge of all that. He wears green. He's described as like a forest guy, and you get sort of what's that guy? The green, I can't remember his name. And the Merry Men. Okay, it's not coming to me. Anyway, you get vibes from him that he's a good wood carver and he helps them out. So those 3 are together. There are many more pages of the general prologue, but I feel like, you know, you can read them if you want to, but you get a feel for how it's written here. It just goes through all the different characters, and then they talk about the contests that they're going to have. So that's the part that you should have read for today. Is there anything that I didn't touch on between the background information and the general prologue part that I asked you to read? The study guide for this one is broken up into parts. So, you know, as you read the different parts, you can go to the study guide and see, am I reading efficiently, you know, using that. But we'll go over it all. At the end, I'll just ask you when we finish with the whole thing, is there anything on the study guide you want me to talk about? All right, so the reading assignment for Thursday is to read, Tuesday is to read The Wife of Bath's prologue and tale. It is pretty long. It's about 28 pages. I will tell you a few things. The Wife of Bath is one of the most robustly described characters. Her prologue, the little part that comes before her tale, is one of the longest, if not the longest, in the Canterbury Tales. And it tells us a whole lot about her. She's going to talk about her 6 husbands that she's had. She's going to talk about, you know, what it takes to attract a man and what a man should do to get a woman, and sort of like male-female relations. And she's going to talk about all that stuff. And then she will launch into her tale, which is a little bit of a romance, a story about knights and ladies, and it's about nobility. And the question of, you might jot this down because it can frame your reading when you go to read it. The question is somebody noble because they were born into it, because they're the son of a noble, or is somebody noble because of their actions and their behaviors? In other words, just because you have money and a title, does that mean you're a good person? And just because you don't have money and a title, does that mean you're a bad person? Like, she brings up the idea that goodness doesn't necessarily follow with nobility. And can you still be a noble person if you are a peasant? Which is kind of a mind-blowing thing for people of the time. So that's the one for Tuesday. Tuesday, we'll talk about that. And then a quick turnaround, because Thursday, we'll talk about the partner's prologue and tale, which is a little bit shorter, but still, you know, a meaty reading assignment. We'll also talk about the Canterbury Tales study guide and discussion topic 2. Maybe we'll talk about discussion topic 2 on Tuesday, because that's a lot for Thursday. I might move that. I do update this frequently, so, you know, when you're looking at it, if it's been up on your screen for a while, you might want to circle it. I'm not going to change what we're reading, but I might add some page numbers, or like here, I'm adding the link to the study guide, stuff like that. All right, any questions on the reading for next time? Let me get something else to drink right here, hold on. All right, are there any questions on the discussion that you need to do for tomorrow by the end of the day? I went over those on Friday and also on Tuesday, so those videos are available to you. All of the videos are being linked down here at the bottom of the unit page. So as we do them, you will see that they will become live links here. Also, you can go to the playlist. There's a link to that on the Start Here page and go through all of the videos for our class throughout the year. And if you need to refresh your memory, but where you are posting the discussion is right here on discussions. Here's the topic. I showed this to you the other day. I have had some people in some classes already submit. If you need to look back and remember the expectations, I went over those last Friday. You can watch the video or you can just click here and remind yourself what I'm looking for and read about the descriptions of the different grading categories. So a good example is going to be like an 85 to 100, depending on how good it is. A fair is like a, what, 70 to 85, and then poor is not really passing, but there's a description here of what I'm looking for. And then here are some examples for you to look over. These are not examples of the topic for any of our discussions, but they're examples of depth. Remember that the word counts are minimal, and that's like the bare basics that you could turn in. And also remember that I'm looking for you to demonstrate your deep understanding of the texts. If all you're doing is telling me stuff that I've already told you in class, that is not going to be a passing score right here. So also, if you don't make direct references to the readings, if you don't go in and quote to demonstrate your understanding beyond just the lectures, that's not going to earn a passing grade either. So I will be available tomorrow. I don't have any classes tomorrow, so I'll mainly be working on grades and planning for next week. So if you have a question, if you're working on your discussion and getting ready to turn it in and you want to ask me anything, feel free to use my Google Voice. You can text me. You can also send me an email and I'll get back to you to help you as you're getting ready to submit. But here's where you will submit. You'll go here. I clicked on discussions over here in the navigation. Discussion number 1, you'll go to create thread. And once you create your thread, you'll be able to see your classmates' threads. And by Monday, you need to reply to 3 of them. And there's a description, and I went over this also last Friday and on Tuesday about what you can write to those people, whoever you decide to. We don't have too many options in this class because there's only 5 students, but yeah. So that's why it's important that you do your post by tomorrow midnight. That way everybody can see what you've written and they have time to turn around and complete their assignment, because this is all one grade. Some people were asking me, I don't know if I talked about this already or not. Some people were asking me and emailing me, are these all separate grades? And this is all one grade together. So your response and your replies to your classmates' responses is all one grade in the grade book. All right, I think that covers everything. Is there anything that I forgot to talk about?